Hello and welcome to this video on studying rare diseases. In other videos, we've already looked at some other kinds of study designs, specifically case reports, case series, as well as ecological studies and cross-sectional studies. So you can find the information for those there. In this particular video, we'll be looking at some of the reasons why we study rare diseases and how we go about doing that. That's a little bit different than some of the other study designs. So I want to start off by first making a note of what exactly is a rare disease. And for most scientists, they classify that if it is less than 1% prevalence in the population or a specific subgroup of the population. You can probably get away with if it's less than 5% still. That's kind of like an in-between zone. But if a disease is more than 5% of the population, then we would not consider that to be a rare disease. So that wouldn't, the things that we're talking about in this video and some of the future ones would not apply to those diseases. And so then a lot of times people will ask, what are some examples of some rare diseases? Well, there are lots and lots of them. A lot of the chromosomal abnormalities are pretty rare. There are a number of different kinds of cancer that aren't very common. Different infectious diseases can be not very common. And it also depends sometimes if you're looking at a specific location or a subgroup. Some examples of diseases that are not rare, specifically in the United States, would be certain cancers like lung, colorectal, breast cancer. Cardiovascular disease is pretty common. Diabetes is pretty common. So we would not be using these techniques for studying those diseases that are not rare. So we really want to make sure before we embark on this particular techniques, the techniques I'll be talking about, that we want to have a rare disease. So I would like to go through a little exercise here at the bottom of the page. And the reason that I'd like to go through this exercise is for the purpose of sharing why scientists would choose this kind of study design and how we went about inventing it in the first place. So specifically, I will never ask you to do this kind of a calculation. But this really underlines the rationale and is really used as just an illustration only. So follow along and you can see some of the reasons why we would choose to have a specific study design for studying rare diseases. So in the past, we've looked at some other kinds of study designs, and specifically cross-sectional comes to mind. When we have a cross-sectional study, we start with the population, so a large group of people, and from that population we draw a much smaller sample. So we might choose just kind of randomly different individual people from that particular population, and they end up here in our sample. Those just a few of the individuals, obviously I'm only drawing a few X's here, but we generally have dozens or hundreds or thousands of people in our sample. But this is much smaller than studying the whole entire population. So we rarely could study absolutely everybody. So we draw this random sample, and then we measure something, and we come up with our data, and then we infer back about our population. Now, when we're drawing this random sample, we are assuming that we're going to proportionately, or we will be likely to proportionally get an even distribution of all the different kinds of people in the population. So let's imagine that we have our rare disease and that it is in fact about 1% of the population. And then let's imagine that we have figured out, based on a sample size and power calculation, that we would like to have a total of 30 cases. Now, if in fact I only have 1% of my population that's cases. The total number of subjects then, I would need to get 3,000 people into my study in order to get just my 30 cases. The rest of them would not be cases. They would not have whatever this rare disease is that I'm studying. And then let's imagine that it costs me $10 per person. I'm just making these numbers up. Some studies cost a lot more than that. There are theoretically some studies that may cost less, but let's just put a dollar amount on it. So my total cost is $30,000. See, even my pen is dying based on that number. That's just a lot of money. If you have that much money and you don't know what to do with it, then come and talk to me, and I can help you find some kind of rare disease that you would like to study for $10 a person. However, most people don't have $30,000, and so they realize that this is kind of rare, and what they would like to do is they'd like to be able to pick out all of the cases, or at least as many as possible, so that they can study those. So in what's called a case control study, let's include all the cases that we know about and then come up with a group to compare that to. So here we're going to still have our 30 cases, but we are intentional about who we include as controls. We try to select controls that are as similar to the cases on a variety of different things that are unrelated to the relationship we're looking at. But let's just imagine that we need to have 30 controls, so we would have a total of 60 subjects. Now, if our study costs $10 a person, this is only going to cost us $600. And so when you compare those two numbers, for a lot of people, for a lot of scientists or researchers or schools or departments or whoever's doing the research, $30,000 is a deal breaker. They just would never ever be able to do that particular research study and do it well. However, a lot of people can come up with $600 to study something, either funds from their institution or some kind of a little micro grant. So even if we were to have 2 controls for every case, we would still only have 90 people. So that would be more like $900. So still, you can see much more doable if we're doing something where we choose all the cases we can find, or at least a whole bunch of them, and then we come up with some kind of a group to compare them to. That is the definition of a case control study, where we are choosing all of the people to include in our study based on the outcome. We already know whether they're a case or a control, and then we include those people in our study so that we can maximize the impact that this particular study can have for a rare disease. So that concludes this video on studying rare diseases and kind of the intro to case control.